The storm arrived before midnight. Snow crashed through the northern forest in violent waves while icy wind bent pine trees hard enough, making old branches snap somewhere beyond the darkness. Most travelers already found shelter hours ago. Anyone still wandering the mountain trails now would likely freeze before sunrise, which meant the figure collapsing outside Alara Vey's cabin should have been dead already. The herbalist heard the sound while grinding dried winterroot beside the fireplace. A heavy thud, then silence. Interesting. Not an animal. Too large. Alara frowned immediately before setting the mortar aside. Nobody visited her cabin this deep in the northern woods unless desperate, lost, or dangerous. Usually all three. The young woman grabbed the hunting knife resting beside the table and crossed carefully toward the front door while storm winds rattled the cabin walls hard enough, dust drifting from ceiling beams above. Another sound followed. A weak groan this time. God above. Alara shoved the heavy wooden door open against the wind and froze. An orc lay half-buried in the snow outside her cabin steps. Huge. Even collapsed. The stranger looked enormous beneath torn fur cloaks soaked dark with blood and melting ice both. One armored shoulder plate hung shattered while deep crimson stains spread steadily across the snow beneath him. Not dead yet. Closed though. The orc tried lifting himself once after noticing the open doorway. Interesting thing about wounded warriors. Sometimes survival instinct outlived the body itself. One gloved hand immediately reached toward the hunting knife still strapped weakly against his belt despite barely remaining conscious. Not aggression. Fear. Like waking beside strangers usually ended badly. Alara studied him silently beneath the storm lantern hanging beside the cabin entrance. Scars crossed visible green skin along his jawline and throat. Fresh blood soaked through heavy wrappings around one side, while old battle wounds covered nearly every exposed inch of him beneath torn armor. Hunter maybe. Soldier definitely. God. The orc's breathing turned ragged against the snow. Then finally he rasped one broken sentence through the storm winds. Don't let them find me. The words barely reached her, still enough hollowing the night air completely. Before Alara could answer, the stranger collapsed fully unconscious at her feet. Wonderful. The herbalist looked toward the forest trails disappearing into blizzard darkness behind him. No horses. No tracks visible anymore beneath the snowstorm. Still, someone wounded him badly enough, sending an armed orc warrior running half-dead through the mountains in winter. Which meant danger probably wasn't far behind. Interesting thing about smart people. They usually lock the door at moments like this. Alara stared down at the unconscious stranger bleeding across her cabin steps while freezing winds screamed through the trees surrounding them. Then muttered quietly, "Oh, this is a terrible idea," and grabbed his arm anyway. God above. The orc weighed nearly twice as much as she did. Dragging him inside became a miserable battle involving snow, blood, curses, and one overturned chair immediately after crossing the doorway. Still, she managed it. Barely. The cabin finally fell quiet again once Alara slammed the heavy door shut against the storm outside. Warm firelight flickered softly across the unconscious orc sprawled beside the hearth, while melting snow pooled beneath torn boots and blood-stained armor. The herbalist crouched carefully beside him, and immediately understood how close death already stood. Arrow wound near the ribs. Deep sword cut across one shoulder. Fever. God above. The stranger should not still be alive. Interesting. Men surviving injuries this severe usually carried terrifying reasons for refusing death. Alara carefully reached toward the hunting knife strapped at his waist. The moment her fingers touched the weapon, the unconscious orc grabbed her wrist instantly, fast enough making her gasp. His eyes snapped open, dark amber, wild with panic. The knife half cleared its sheath before pain visibly hit him hard enough, stopping the movement entirely. Interesting thing about traumatized warriors. Even dying, they still expected enemies first. Easy, Alara muttered quickly. Wrong word. The orc recoiled violently against the floorboards despite obvious agony tearing through his side now. Not because she threatened him, because kindness probably frightened him worse. God. The herbalist slowly raised both hands away from the knife. You collapsed outside my cabin, she said carefully. I'm trying to help you. The stranger stared at her silently through fever-bright eyes while storm winds roared beyond the cabin walls outside. Then finally, barely conscious again, He whispered. Should have left me there. The sentence settled heavy between them. Not dramatic. Not angry. Exhausted. Like surviving itself no longer felt worthwhile. Alara looked toward the scarred, wounded orc hunter bleeding beside her fireplace, while winter storms buried the forest outside beneath darkness and snow. Then quietly answered, too late now. And somewhere deep beneath the fear, pain, and exhaustion flooding his expression, the orc looked startled someone chose saving him at all. The orc tried leaving before sunrise. Alara discovered him halfway across the cabin floor, bleeding through fresh bandages while using a chair for balance and pure stubbornness for everything else. God above. The herbalist dropped the basket of herbs immediately. Are you insane? The wounded orc froze beside the doorway. Interesting thing about dangerous men. Even exhausted half to death, they still moved quietly. Snowlight filtered pale blue through the frosted cabin windows, while storm winds continued screaming outside hard enough, burying the forest trails completely overnight. The orc looked terrible. Fever flushed dark green skin beneath old battle scars, while blood soaked steadily through the clean wrappings. Alara spent hours stitching around his ribs and shoulder after dragging him inside last night. Still, he kept one hand near the hunting knife strapped weakly at his side. Always near the weapon. Interesting. Not aggression. Security. Like sleep without a blade nearby felt impossible. You need lying down, Alara muttered, crossing toward him. Wrong direction. Immediately the orc stiffened visibly. Not because she threatened him. Because adults approaching too quickly probably meant danger in his experience. The herbalist stopped several feet away instead. Your stitches will tear. The stranger's breathing roughened slightly. Not staying. Wonderful. Alara crossed her arms slowly. You can barely stand. Silence. Then quietly. Still leaving. God. The stubbornness inside his voice almost impressed her. Almost. Outside, another blast of winter wind slammed snow against the cabin walls hard enough, making old beams groan overhead. Alara pointed sharply toward the windows. Into what exactly? The orc looked toward the storm briefly. Interesting. Not fear. Calculation. Like he honestly considered surviving it anyway. The herbalist rubbed tiredly at her forehead. You'll freeze before reaching the lower trails. Better than. The stranger stopped suddenly. God above. The unfinished sentence lingered heavily between them. Better than what? Being found? Being captured? Being cared for? Interesting thing about wounded people. Sometimes they feared survival more than death. The orc swayed dangerously beside the doorway. Then collapsed. Again. Wonderful. Alara barely caught him before his head hit the floorboards. The moment she touched him, the stranger reacted instantly despite fever and exhaustion both. One hand grabbed her wrist hard enough, bruising, while the knife flashed halfway free from its sheath again. Fast. Terrifyingly fast. Dark amber eyes snapped open, wild with panic. Don't. The word broke apart beneath ragged breathing. God. Not threat. Fear. The realization hit Alara sharply. This man expected pain waking beside strangers automatically. The herbalist carefully kept her voice steady despite the knife inches from her throat. I'm not hurting you. Silence stretched. Then slowly, very slowly, the orc loosened his grip first. Interesting. Like part of him realized attacking her made no sense, but instinct reached weapons before logic could catch up. Alara helped drag him back toward the fireplace afterward, while the stranger remained tense enough, feeling it through every movement. Not relaxed once. Not even exhausted. The cabin settled quiet around them once she finally forced him onto the cot near the hearth. Warm firelight flickered softly across scarred green skin and bloodstained bandages, while snowstorms swallowed the world beyond the windows outside. The orc watched her every second. Interesting thing about traumatized warriors. They tracked exits, hands, and possible threats before anything else. Alara crouched beside the medicine shelf, gathering fresh cloth and willow bark paste. You got a name? Silence. Of course. The stranger studied her carefully before finally answering. Rag. The name sounded rough beneath fever and exhaustion both. Alara nodded once while checking the torn shoulder bandages again. You always threaten healers with knives. One corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Interesting. Almost humor. Gone immediately afterward. Usually don't wake up alive afterward. God above. The sentence hollowed the warm little cabin completely. Not bitterness. Experience. The herbalist glanced toward him carefully while replacing fresh wrappings around the wound. Rhaeg never looked away from her hands. Always watching. Always prepared. God, what happened to you? The orc's entire body tightened instantly. Interesting. Not discomfort. Danger. Like answering honestly could get people killed. Bandits, he answered flatly. Lie. Alara noticed immediately. Men didn't carry military-grade arrows and torture scars because of random thieves. Still, she let it go for now. Pushed too hard, and wounded animals bit first. Outside, the storm worsened while darkness slowly faded into pale gray morning beyond the windows. Inside, the cabin remained warm except for the tension coiled constantly through the massive orc warrior resting beside the hearth with one hand never straying far from the knife at his side. Then unexpectedly, Alara noticed something else. Every time his eyes drifted shut from exhaustion, they snapped open again seconds later. Not ordinary caution. Fear. Like sleeping deeply once cost him something terrible. God above, the herbalist quietly set fresh tea beside the cot. You know, she muttered softly. Most people say thank you after being rescued from freezing to death. Rhaeg stared toward the fire silently for several long moments. Then finally, rough enough almost missing it beneath the crackling flames, he whispered, most people leave orcs to die in the snow. The sentence settled painfully through the cabin, because he said it like simple truth, not accusation. And watching the wounded hunter force himself staying awake beside her fireplace because somewhere in his brutal past sleep became more dangerous than pain, Alara Vey realized one heartbreaking truth completely. Whatever chased Rhaeg through the mountains, it already stole his ability to believe safety lasted through the night. Rhaeg never relaxed inside the cabin. Alara noticed it by the second day. Interesting thing about people shaped by violence. Peace unsettled them more than danger sometimes. The storm outside finally weakened into steady snowfall, while pale winter sunlight filtered softly through the frosted windows. Most wounded men would have spent the morning sleeping beside the warm fireplace after nearly dying in the mountains. Not Rhaeg. The orc hunter sat awake near the hearth sharpening his knife despite fever still burning visibly beneath scarred green skin and fresh bandages wrapped tightly across his ribs. One eye constantly tracked the windows. The other watched the door. Always watching. God above, Alara stirred dried herbs beside the kitchen table, quietly studying him while the cabin remained wrapped in heavy forest silence. No conversation. No footsteps outside. No danger visible anywhere. Still, the massive orc warrior looked tense enough, expecting arrows crashing through the windows any second. You know the trees aren't planning murdering you, Alara muttered finally. Rhaeg glanced toward the forest beyond the glass automatically before answering. Trees don't worry me. Interesting. The sentence landed too quickly. Too honestly. The herbalist leaned one shoulder against the table, crossing her arms slowly. Who does? Silence stretched heavily through the warm little cabin. Then Rhaeg returned attention toward the knife blade instead. Of course. Interesting thing about traumatized people. Questions about fear often sounded like traps. Alara sighed softly through her nose before returning to the herbs. Outside, snow drifted lazily through the pines surrounding the cabin while smoke curled peacefully from the chimney overhead. Inside, the atmosphere still felt like a battlefield waiting to happen. Later that afternoon, Alara stepped outside, briefly gathering frozen firewood from the storage shed beside the tree line. When she returned moments later, she found Rhaeg standing near the front door despite barely remaining upright earlier. Knife drawn, breathing sharp. God above, the orc looked genuinely alarmed. What happened? Alara asked immediately. Rhaeg's eyes snapped toward her, then toward the open snow behind, then back again. Interesting. Like he tracked her movements while she stepped outside. You were gone too long. The sentence nearly stopped her completely. Not accusation. Panic. The herbalist stared toward him quietly while snow melted from her gloves onto the cabin floorboards. How long exactly? Rhaeg frowned slightly. Several minutes. God. The man reacted to 5 minutes of silence like abandonment already arrived. Interesting thing about lonely people. You recognized abandonment fear quickly because part of you carried it too. Alara carefully set the firewood down beside the hearth. I was gathering logs, not dying heroically in the woods. For one brief second, something almost resembling embarrassment crossed the orc's face. Gone immediately afterward. still enough noticing. The herbalist hid a small smile while crossing toward the cooking pot hanging above the fire. You're impossible. Alive, though. Interesting. Dry humor. Tiny thing. Still enough warming the room slightly. That evening the cabin settled quieter than usual, while snowfall buried the forest deeper beneath moonlit silence outside. Rhaeg remained restless. Alara noticed him checking the windows repeatedly between sharpening arrows beside the fire. Again and again. Finally, she looked up from her book. If you stare at the trees hard enough, they'll eventually feel judged. The orc snorted softly before stopping himself. Interesting. Like laughter felt unfamiliar now, too. Then suddenly his expression hardened again. Rhaeg crossed toward the side window fast enough, making Alara immediately sit upright. What? The hunter stayed silent, listening. God above. The herbalist realized something important then. The cabin felt too quiet for him. Not comforting quiet. Wrong quiet. Like soldiers surviving battlefields long enough forgot what peace sounded like entirely. Rhaeg finally relaxed several seconds later before stepping away from the window again. Nothing. Lie. Still. Different kind this time. Not hiding danger from her. Protecting her from fear, maybe. Interesting. Alara closed the book slowly before asking, how long were you fighting? The orc froze instantly. There it was again. Not discomfort. Memory. Long enough. God. The answer sounded exhausted beyond years. The herbalist watched firelight flicker across the old scars lining his jaw and throat, while winter winds whispered softly beyond the cabin walls outside. Then quietly she said, you keep looking at this place like it's temporary. Silence stretched. Rhaeg stared toward the fire for several long moments before finally answering. Safe places usually are. The sentence hollowed the room completely. Not bitterness. Experience again. Like every shelter he ever trusted eventually burned down around him. Alara looked toward the wounded orc hunter sitting rigid beside her fireplace with one hand never far from a weapon because somewhere deep inside him peace already felt dangerous. Then softly she asked, when's the last time nobody tried killing you for a whole week? Rhaeg blinked once. Actually considered the question. God above. That told her everything. Finally, the orc muttered, don't remember. The cabin fell silent afterward except for crackling firewood and distant winter winds moving through the northern forest outside. And watching the scarred hunter struggle more with quiet safety than battle wounds, Alara Vey realized one painful truth completely. Rhaeg didn't know how surviving without fear was supposed to feel anymore. Alara discovered the scars 4 nights later. Rhaeg's fever returned just after midnight. The herbalist woke hearing something crash beside the fireplace before finding the orc hunter half collapsed against the table, breathing hard enough, sounding painful. One hand braced against his injured ribs while sweat soaked through the bandages wrapped tightly around his shoulder and chest. God above. The infection spread deeper than she feared. You tore the stitches again, Alara muttered, crossing toward him quickly. Rhaeg immediately tried straightening despite obvious agony. Interesting thing about wounded warriors. Some would rather bleed than look weak in front of anyone. I'm fine. Lie. The orc nearly fell attempting one step toward the water basin. Wonderful. Alara caught his arm before he hit the floorboards completely. The moment she touched him, Rhaeg physically tensed beneath her grip. Not anger. Reflex. Like hands grabbing him usually ended badly. God. The herbalist guided him carefully toward the chair beside the fireplace anyway, while storm winds rattled softly against the cabin walls outside. You're burning alive, she muttered while reaching for fresh cloth and medicine jars. Armor off. Instant reaction. Rhaeg froze completely. Interesting. Not embarrassment. Fear. The cabin fell silent except for crackling firewood and uneven breathing. Alara noticed immediately. The hunter's hand drifted automatically toward the knife resting beside the chair. Not threatening her. Grounding himself maybe. Like weapons felt safer than vulnerability. Rhaeg, Alara said carefully, I need checking the wound. Silence stretched heavily. Then finally the orc whispered. No. The word landed too fast. Too sharp. God above. The herbalist studied him quietly while firelight flickered across fever-bright amber eyes and old scars lining his throat. Interesting thing about trauma. People often feared being seen more than being hurt. Alara, Rhaeg swallowed hard visibly. Don't. Not command. Plea. The realization hit her sharply. Whatever hid beneath that armor terrified him. The herbalist crouched slowly beside the chair, keeping her voice soft. "You're bleeding through the bandages." Reg stared toward the fire silently for several long moments afterward. Then finally, like surrendering something painful, he reached trembling hands toward the leather straps securing the armor across his chest. Alara helped carefully after the fever made his fingers unreliable. One buckle, then another. Heavy armor plates hit the floorboards softly beside the fireplace. And God above, the herbalist stopped breathing. Scars. Hundreds of them. Not battle wounds. Torture. Long, brutal lash marks crossed nearly every inch of the orc's back and shoulders beneath pale green skin carved apart so severely parts barely looked human anymore. Thick burn scars layered across older whip wounds while jagged knife marks cut between them in deliberate patterns. Jesus Christ. Reg immediately looked away from her face. Interesting. Shame. Like he already expected disgust once people saw. The cabin suddenly felt too small around all that pain. Alara stared silently while cold fury twisted deep inside her chest. Not loud anger. The kind making violence understandable. "These aren't from war," she whispered. Reg barked out one short humorless laugh. "No. God." The single word carried exhaustion older than the man himself. The orc kept his gaze fixed toward the fire while Alara carefully cleaned reopened stitches along his shoulder. "You were prisoner." Not question. Reg's jaw tightened visibly. Several times. Jesus. The casualness nearly made her sick. Interesting thing about survivors. They often spoke about horrors too calmly because emotions became dangerous long ago. Alara gently pressed fresh medicine against one deep scar, crossing his ribs. Reg physically flinched. Not from pain. Memory. God above. The realization hollowed her chest. Someone hurt this man badly enough touch itself still carried ghosts afterward. The herbalist forced her voice steady. "Who did this?" Silence stretched. Heavy silence. Then finally, quiet enough nearly losing it beneath the fire. Reg answered. "Everyone." The sentence shattered something inside her completely. Not dramatic bitterness. Worse. Acceptance. Like cruelty became so constant, he stopped separating enemies anymore. Alara wrapped clean bandages carefully around his shoulder while winter storms whispered through the forest outside. Then suddenly she noticed something else. The oldest scars looked smaller, higher across the shoulders. God. Childhood injuries. The thought physically hurt. Reg noticed her expression immediately and tensed again. Interesting. Not fear of pain. Fear she'd pity him now. The herbalist sat back slowly beside the fireplace. "You survived all that." The orc stared toward the flames silently for several long moments, then finally muttered, "Unfortunately." God above. The exhaustion inside that word nearly broke her. Because suddenly Alara understood something terrible. Reg didn't see survival as victory anymore. Just obligation. The cabin stayed quiet afterward while fresh snow drifted softly through the northern woods outside, and firelight flickered across scars nobody should carry alone. Then softly, before she could stop herself, Alara reached toward one of the old lash marks crossing his shoulder. Reg froze instantly beneath her touch. Not recoiling this time. Just still. Interesting. Like kindness after seeing the damage confused him more than cruelty ever could. "You deserved better than this," she whispered. Silence crashed through the warm little cabin. Heavy enough, barely breathing through. The orc hunter stared into the fire afterward with something shattered and uncertain flickering briefly behind amber eyes hardened by war and suffering both. Because maybe, just maybe, nobody had ever said those words to him before. The confession came during the coldest night of winter. Snow buried the northern forest beneath endless white silence while icy wind clawed against the cabin walls hard enough, making the old windows tremble inside their frames. Alara couldn't sleep. Not after seeing the scars. Not after hearing Reg speak about torture like discussing weather instead of pain. God above. The herbalist found him awake beside the fireplace again just after midnight. Of course he was. Interesting thing about broken soldiers. Nightmares usually arrive the moment sleep finally won. Reg sat on the floor near the hearth sharpening his hunting knife slowly while shadows flickered across scarred green skin and tired amber eyes. The cabin remained quiet except for crackling firewood and distant winter winds moving through the pines outside. Alara crossed the room carrying 2 cups of hot pine tea before sitting carefully beside him. The orc glanced toward the second cup briefly, then toward her. Interesting. Like small kindnesses still surprised him every time. You should sleep, he muttered finally. So should you. Silence stretched. Neither moved. God. The herbalist studied the exhausted warrior beside her while firelight danced softly across old scars lining his throat and jaw. Then quietly she asked, "What were you running from?" Reg froze instantly. There it was again. Not anger. Memory. The knife stopped moving between his hands while tension settled visibly through broad shoulders beneath loose bandages and worn clothes. Alara almost apologized. Almost. Then the orc whispered, "Myself." The sentence hollowed the room completely. Not dramatic. Exhausted. Like he genuinely believed he became something terrible already. Outside, snowstorms whispered softly beyond the cabin walls while silence settled heavy between them. Then finally Reg leaned back against the hearthstones and closed his eyes briefly. I had a brother. God above. Alara stayed still, listening, because someone should. The orc's voice roughened slightly beneath exhaustion and old grief both. His name was Dren. For one brief second, something warm flickered across Reg's face. Memory. Love. Gone almost immediately afterward. He was younger. Another pause. Too loud. Always laughing. One corner of the hunter's mouth twitched faintly. Terrible hunter. Interesting thing about grief. People always remembered small useless details first. Alara wrapped both hands around the warm teacup quietly while snow drifted against the windows outside. We fought in the Northern War together. Reg stared toward the fire now instead of her. Same hunting unit. God. The herbalist already hated where this story ended. The orc swallowed hard before continuing. Our commanders abandoned half the scouting parties during retreat. Another pause. Said wounded soldiers slowed everyone else down. Jesus Christ. Reg's fingers tightened around the knife handle resting across his lap. Dren took an arrow protecting me. His voice lowered dangerously calm. Should have killed him immediately. Silence crashed heavily through the cabin. Not enough, though, because Reg kept speaking anyway. We got trapped in the mountains after the retreat collapsed. Another pause. No medicine. No horses. He stared into the flames without blinking. Only snow. God above. Alara felt grief settling cold inside her chest already. Interesting thing about survivors. Sometimes the worst wounds came from staying alive longer than someone else. Reg finally looked toward her then, and the pain inside his eyes nearly shattered her completely. I carried him for 3 days. The words came out broken. Not from weakness. From memory. He kept apologizing. Another pause. Even dying, he apologized because he thought slowing me down meant I'd die too. Jesus. The herbalist physically stopped breathing for one horrible second. Reg laughed softly afterward. Broken sound. He was freezing to death and still worried about me. Silence swallowed the warm little cabin entirely. Then finally the orc whispered the sentence destroying everything. I buried my brother in the snow. God above. The grief inside those words felt enormous. Ancient somehow. Reg stared toward the fire while tears gathered silently in exhausted amber eyes he clearly hated letting her see. I promised I'd come back for him after the storm passed. Another pause. But the snow buried the whole valley before I could. Alara's chest physically hurt hearing it, because suddenly she understood why this man looked so haunted by winter itself. Reg survived. Dren didn't. Interesting thing about grief. People often carried impossible guilt for things nature decided instead. The orc rubbed one rough, scarred hand across his face quickly before emotion escaped completely. I kept thinking, his voice cracked slightly. If I carried him faster. If I stopped resting. If I found shelter sooner. No. The word escaped Alara instantly. Reg froze. The herbalist turned fully toward him beside the fire. That wasn't your fault. Silence crashed between them. Heavy. Sharp enough cutting skin. And God. The confusion on his face nearly broke her completely. Like the possibility he wasn't responsible genuinely never occurred to him before. Reg stared toward the flames again afterward while winter storms moved softly through the forest outside. Then finally he whispered. He was all I had left. The sentence settled painfully through the cabin. Not just grief. Loneliness. The kind hollowing people from inside over time. Alara carefully reached toward his hand resting beside the fire. Reg physically tensed beneath the touch immediately. Still. After everything. Then slowly. Very slowly. He let her hold it anyway. And sitting beside the scarred orc hunter who carried his brother's death through every silent winter night since the war ended, Alara Vey realized one heartbreaking truth completely. Rhaeg wasn't running from enemies in the mountains. He was running from the guilt of surviving alone. Spring arrived slowly in the northern forest. Snow melted first from the cabin roof, then from the narrow trails winding through the pines, and finally from the frozen river beside Alara's garden, where winter ice cracked apart beneath warmer sunlight. And somehow, the cabin changed too. Not because the walls looked different, because Rhaeg stayed. Interesting thing about lonely people. You noticed another person's absence before realizing their presence became important. At first, the orc hunter only remained because his wounds hadn't healed enough surviving the mountains alone again. That's what both of them pretended anyway. But days became weeks. And slowly, the cabin stopped feeling temporary. Rhaeg repaired things automatically now. Broken fence posts, leaking roof boards. The unstable woodshed door Alara avoided fixing for nearly 2 years because climbing ladders alone felt annoying and dangerous both. The massive orc warrior handled every task silently, like usefulness came more naturally than rest ever would. Interesting. He still apologized whenever taking up space too long, though. God above. One rainy morning, Alara descended toward the kitchen expecting silence and empty rooms. Instead, she found fresh firewood stacked neatly beside the hearth and stew already simmering above the fire, while Rhaeg sat near the doorway sharpening hunting arrows beneath soft spring light. Warm. Ordinary. The sight nearly stopped her completely, because suddenly the cabin looked lived in again, not haunted by loneliness anymore. Rhaeg glanced up briefly. You sleep late. Alara crossed her arms dramatically. Some of us don't enjoy waking before sunrise voluntarily. One corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Interesting thing about healing. Sometimes it revealed itself through tiny, almost smiles first. The herbalist hid her own smile while reaching for teacups. Outside, rain whispered softly through the trees surrounding the cabin, while distant birdsong drifted across the forest for the first time since winter ended. Peaceful. Mostly. Rhaeg still checked windows constantly. Still slept lightly beside the fireplace with one knife hidden beneath the blankets nearby. Still woke from nightmares some nights breathing hard enough, making Alara pretend not hearing it through the thin cabin walls. But now, he stayed afterward instead of disappearing into the woods alone until sunrise. Progress. Fragile, beautiful progress. Later that afternoon, Alara returned from gathering herbs near the riverbank only to find something strange. Silence. Not peaceful silence either. Wrong silence. Interesting. The herbalist stepped cautiously through the cabin doorway, expecting danger. Instead, she found Rhaeg sitting beside the table staring toward nothing at all, while blood-stained fresh bandages wrapped around one scarred hand. God above. What happened? The orc blinked once like returning from somewhere distant. Cut myself. Alara frowned, immediately crossing toward him. On what? Silence. Then finally, wood-carving knife. Interesting. The answer confused her briefly, until she noticed the small object resting unfinished beside his hand. A wooden wolf. Poorly carved. Still recognizable. The herbalist stared toward it quietly, while something warm twisted unexpectedly through her chest. Drin liked wolves, Rhaeg muttered without looking up. God, there it was again. Grief appearing in quiet, ordinary moments instead of dramatic ones. Alara gently took his injured hand despite the automatic tension still passing through him whenever touched unexpectedly. You're terrible at carving. For one brief second. Rhaeg laughed. Real laugh. Low and rough from disuse. Still enough warming the cabin more than the fire ever managed. Interesting thing about wounded people. Joy often sounded surprised leaving them. The herbalist smiled while wrapping fresh cloth around the shallow cut. You know, she muttered softly. Most guests eventually stop nearly bleeding to death in my house. Rhaeg watched her carefully then. Not guarded this time. Something softer. More uncertain. You keep calling me guest. The sentence settled quietly between them. God above. Alara suddenly realized she'd started waiting for his footsteps each evening without noticing when exactly that happened. The cabin felt emptier whenever he disappeared into the forest checking traps or gathering game. She listened automatically for the heavy sound of boots returning across the porch after sunset. Interesting thing about loneliness. You forgot how loud silence truly was until someone interrupted it long enough. Outside, rain softened into gentle spring drizzle, while warm firelight flickered softly through the little cabin. Reg flexed his freshly bandaged hand once before speaking quieter. I should leave soon. The words hit harder than expected. Alara looked down toward the unfinished wooden wolf resting beside the table, then quietly asked, Do you want to? Silence stretched. Heavy. Honest. Finally the orc answered, No. God. The simple truth inside that one word nearly shattered something inside her chest completely. Because suddenly Alara understood something terrifying. The wounded hunter who collapsed dying outside her cabin months ago no longer felt like a stranger passing through her life. He felt like home. And watching the scarred orc warrior sit quietly beside her kitchen table carving clumsy wooden wolves, because grief finally hurt less inside a warm, safe cabin, Alara Vey realized one extraordinary truth completely. Some people didn't heal because time passed. They healed because someone finally gave them a place where leaving stopped feeling necessary. Reg sensed the soldiers before sunrise. Alara woke to the sound of him loading arrows beside the fireplace. Not casually either. Fast. Precise. Dangerously quiet. Interesting thing about warriors surviving too many battles. Their bodies recognized threats long before the world looked different. The herbalist pushed herself upright beneath the blankets while pale gray dawn barely touched the cabin windows. What happened? Reg didn't answer immediately. That alone terrified her. The orc stood near the front window motionless, except for one hand tightening slowly around the bowstring resting beside him. Then finally he muttered, Company. God above. Alara crossed toward the window carefully and immediately felt cold dread settle inside her chest. Riders. 6 of them moving through the snowy tree line below the cabin trail. Armed. Not hunters either. Military. Dark iron armor reflected weak morning light, while horses pushed through melting snow toward the isolated cabin with terrifying certainty. They knew exactly where they were going. Reg stepped away from the window instantly. You need leaving. Interesting. Not we. Still protecting her first. The herbalist crossed her arms sharply. Absolutely not. The orc's expression hardened immediately. Alara. No. Simple word. Still enough stopping the room briefly. Outside. Horses continued climbing the narrow forest path, while ravens scattered from nearby branches overhead. Ray grabbed his weapons, quickly moving through the cabin with frightening efficiency now. Warrior again. Not wounded traveler. God. The change unsettled her. I'll draw them away from here, he muttered while securing knives beneath his coat. Wrong sentence. Immediately wrong. Alara stepped directly into his path. You're injured. Less dead than before. This isn't funny. No, Reg looked toward the approaching riders through the window again. It isn't. Silence crashed heavily between them. The herbalist suddenly realized something terrible. He expected dying today. Interesting thing about traumatized soldiers. They often treated survival like temporary luck eventually running out. Outside, the lead rider finally stopped beneath the cabin clearing while the others spread through the trees surrounding the property carefully. Professional. God above. One man dismounted carrying official documents sealed with northern military insignias. Reg went pale seeing them. Not fear. Recognition. Alara felt her stomach tighten immediately. Who are they? The orc stared silently toward the seals before answering. My former commanders. Jesus Christ. The knock against the cabin door sounded calm. Polite even. Which somehow made everything worse. Captain Rieger. A voice called from outside. Orders were clear. Don't make this difficult. Captain. God. Alara looked sharply toward Reg. The orc never took his eyes from the door. I told you bandits sounded suspicious. Interesting. Dry humor during possible execution. Definitely coping badly. The knock came again. We know you're inside. Reg reached for the front latch slowly. Alara grabbed his wrist instantly. No. The orc looked toward her. And God above. The exhaustion inside his eyes nearly shattered her completely. They'll burn the cabin searching otherwise. The simple practicality hurt worse somehow. Like sacrifice came naturally now. The herbalist stepped closer anyway, lowering her voice. You don't owe these men your life. Something flickered briefly across Reg's face then. Pain maybe. Gratitude. Gone quickly afterward. They already took it years ago. The sentence hollowed the warm little cabin completely. Outside, impatient footsteps crunched across melting snow toward the porch. Then the voice sharpened. Open the door. Rhaeg gently pulled his wrist free from Alara's grip before resting one rough, scarred hand briefly against her shoulder. Interesting thing about lonely people. Small touches often felt enormous. You saved me once already, he muttered softly. Don't waste it. God above. The herbalist realized suddenly this wasn't fear speaking. It was farewell. Absolutely not. Before Rhaeg could reach the door, Alara crossed the cabin first and yanked it open hard enough cold spring air burst inside immediately. 6 armed soldiers waited outside beneath gray morning skies. The leader stepped forward instantly, then stopped after seeing her instead of Rhaeg. Interesting. Apparently, he expected less resistance. The officer removed leather gloves slowly while studying the cabin behind her. Where is Captain Rieger? Alara crossed her arms. Busy. One younger soldier blinked once. God above. Even Rhaeg looked startled behind her. The officer's expression darkened slightly. This matter belongs to military authority. No, Alara answered flatly. It belongs to the wounded man you tried murdering. Silence crashed through the snowy clearing. Sharp enough cutting skin. Interesting thing about powerful men. They hated civilians refusing fear properly. The officer lowered his voice dangerously. Captain Rieger abandoned Northern Command during wartime. Rhaeg stepped into the doorway behind her then, and suddenly the entire clearing changed. Every soldier visibly tensed. Not because he moved aggressively, because they feared him. God. The realization hit Alara instantly. Whatever happened during that war? These men respected Rhaeg far more than they admitted. The officer's jaw tightened visibly. You deserted. Rhaeg stared toward him coldly. You ordered children executed. Silence exploded through the forest, heavy enough stopping birdsong entirely. Alara physically stopped breathing for one horrible second. The soldiers looked away. Interesting. Not shock. Guilt. God above. The officer's face hardened instantly. Those villages sheltered enemy forces. They sheltered families. The calm fury inside Rhaeg's voice felt terrifying suddenly. Not loud anger. Worse. Truth. The officer reached slowly toward his sword. You were commanded. Rhaeg stepped forward one pace. And you were wrong. Silence crashed again across the snowy clearing while spring winds moved softly through the trees surrounding the cabin. And standing beside the scarred orc hunter finally confronting the war that destroyed him piece by piece, Alara Vey realized one horrifying truth completely. Rhaeg wasn't hunted because he failed the army. He was hunted because he refused becoming the monster they wanted. The soldiers attacked just before sunset. Tension poisoned the entire day afterward. The officers never left the clearing below the cabin. Horses remained tied near the frozen riverbank while armed soldiers rotated watch shifts through the surrounding forest trails like wolves circling wounded prey, patiently waiting for weakness. Interesting thing about military men. They preferred intimidation before violence whenever possible. Inside the cabin, silence stretched heavy enough hurting. Rhaeg sharpened blades near the fireplace without speaking while Alara prepared healing supplies at the kitchen table, pretending her hands weren't shaking slightly. God above. The cabin no longer felt safe. Not because of the soldiers themselves. Because Rhaeg looked ready sacrificing himself the moment things turned worse. The herbalist hated recognizing that expression already. Outside, twilight slowly darkened the forest while snow drifted softly through the pines surrounding the isolated cabin. Then suddenly, movement. Rhaeg stood instantly before Alara, even heard footsteps outside. Interesting thing about warriors surviving war. Their bodies always notice danger first. The orc crossed toward the window sharply before muttering one cold word. Down. Wrong tone. Immediate danger. Alara dropped beside the table, just as an arrow exploded through the front window, showering glass across the cabin floorboards. God above. Another arrow followed seconds later, slamming deep into the fireplace beam where Rhaeg stood moments earlier. The soldiers weren't negotiating anymore. Wonderful. Rhaeg grabbed his bow instantly while crossing toward the broken window. No. Alara caught his arm hard enough, stopping him briefly. There's too many. The orc looked toward her, and the calm acceptance inside his eyes terrified her more than the attack itself. They're here for me. Wrong sentence. Wrong choice. The herbalist physically shoved him backward away from the window before another arrow split through the cabin wall. They're attacking my home, she snapped. That makes it my problem too. For one brief second, Rhaeg looked stunned. Interesting. Like nobody ever chose standing beside him once danger appeared. Outside, voices shouted through the trees. "Take him alive." Another soldier answered immediately. "The woman too?" Silence. Then the officer's cold reply drifted through the snowfall. "If necessary." God. Raig's entire expression changed. Not fear. Fury. The kind arriving suddenly and completely. Interesting thing about traumatized protectors. Threatening someone they loved usually ended badly for everybody else. The orc moved before Alara could stop him. Fast. Terrifyingly fast. Raig kicked the cabin door open hard enough it slammed against the outer wall, while one arrow already rested drawn against the bowstring in his hands. The first soldier dropped before fully raising his weapon. Arrow through the shoulder. Clean shot. The second man rushed from the tree line immediately afterward, only for Raig's hunting knife flashing silver through the falling snow and burying deep into the soldier's thigh. God above. The herbalist physically froze watching him fight. Not savage. Precise. Efficient. Years of war compressed into brutal movements, wasting nothing. Outside, chaos exploded through the clearing while soldiers scrambled for cover behind trees and snow-covered rocks. Raig stepped directly between the cabin and every armed man in the forest. Protective. Always protective. An arrow grazed his injured shoulder moments later. The orc barely reacted. "Jesus Christ." "Raig!" Alara shouted. The hunter ignored her entirely while driving another soldier backward through the snow with terrifying calm. Interesting thing about wounded warriors. Pain stopped mattering once survival instincts fully woke. Then the officer appeared near the riverbank, drawing a crossbow slowly toward the cabin itself. Not toward Raig. Toward her. God above. Everything happened fast afterward. Alara saw the crossbow lift. Saw the bolt release. And before she could even move, Raig threw himself directly in front of her. The bolt slammed deep into his side. The sound nearly stopped her heart completely. The orc staggered hard against the cabin doorway while blood spread instantly through dark fur and leather beneath the snowfall. Raig. Fury exploded across the clearing afterward. Not loud. Worse. Silent. The kind born from grief and survival, and finally having something worth protecting again. Raig ripped the crossbow bolt free with one brutal movement before turning toward the officer slowly. Every soldier in the clearing visibly stepped backward. Interesting. They feared him. God. The officer looked terrified now too. Good. Raig crossed the snow toward him through falling winter ash, and blood like war itself finally returned from the dead. "You should have left," the officer whispered shakily. The orc's voice came out cold enough, freezing the air. "You threatened her." Simple sentence. Still enough saying everything. The officer reached desperately for another weapon. Too slow. Raig knocked him flat into the snow before the blade even cleared halfway. Then stopped. Interesting. The herbalist realized suddenly. Raig could kill him easily, but didn't. Because despite everything war turned him into, part of him still refused becoming a monster. The remaining soldiers retreated minutes later, dragging wounded men back toward the forest trail, while snow continued falling softly across the ruined clearing. Silence returned slowly afterward. Then Raig collapsed. God above. Alara caught him before he hit the frozen ground completely, while blood soaked rapidly through her sleeves, and the cabin behind them stood scarred with arrows and shattered windows. The orc looked exhausted suddenly. More than wounded. Emotionally exhausted. Interesting thing about lonely warriors. Sometimes they fought hardest only after finding someone worth surviving for. Raig stared weakly toward her while snow melted across dark lashes and scarred green skin. Then finally whispered, "I told you leaving me outside would have been easier." The herbalist felt tears burning hot behind her eyes despite the freezing wind. She tightened her grip around him instead. "No," Alara answered shakily. "It would have been lonelier." And holding the wounded orc hunter in the snow outside the shattered cabin, while soldiers vanished into the darkening forest beyond them, Alara realized one undeniable truth completely. Raig no longer fought to survive alone anymore. He fought because losing her finally scared him more than dying. Raig nearly died again that night. Blood covered everything. Bandages. Floorboards. Her hands. God above. Interesting thing about fear. You only realized how much someone mattered once the thought of losing them became unbearable. By dawn, the bleeding finally slowed. Barely. Reg slept heavily near the hearth afterward while snowlight filtered pale and cold through patched blankets covering the broken windows. Alara remained awake beside him anyway, watching, listening, waiting for each breath. The cabin felt painfully quiet after violence finally ended. Outside, fresh snow buried bloodstains across the clearing, slowly erasing evidence soldiers were ever there at all. Inside, nothing felt the same anymore, because the attack changed something. Not just safety, them. The herbalist realized it fully sometime near sunrise while carefully replacing cool cloths against Reg's fevered skin. She couldn't imagine the cabin empty again. God, the thought hurt too much. Reg finally woke late that afternoon. His eyes opened slowly beneath exhaustion and pain both before immediately searching the room. Interesting. Even half-conscious, he still checked for danger first. Then his gaze landed on Alara sitting beside the cot. And relaxed. Tiny thing. Still enough breaking her heart somehow. You're staring, he muttered weakly. The herbalist crossed her arms dramatically despite relief, nearly collapsing her completely. You got shot. Reg considered that briefly. Rude of them. God above. Alara barked out one startled laugh before covering her face tiredly. Interesting thing about surviving terror. Sometimes laughter escaped afterward because crying felt too enormous. The orc watched her quietly for several long seconds while firelight flickered softly across scarred green skin and fever-bright amber eyes. Then softly he asked, "Why didn't you run?" The question hollowed the cabin instantly. Not accusation. Confusion. Like staying beside him once soldiers attacked genuinely made no sense. Alara lowered her hand slowly. Because this is my home. Reg's expression tightened faintly. They almost destroyed it. No, the herbalist looked directly at him. They tried destroying you. Silence crashed heavily between them. God. The emotion flickering behind his eyes looked dangerously close to grief. Interesting thing about lonely people. Kindness often hurt because they didn't know where putting it afterward. Reg looked away toward the fireplace. You shouldn't have risked yourself. There you go again. The orc frowned slightly. Again, talking like your life matters less than everyone else's. Silence. Then Reg whispered. Maybe it does. Wrong sentence. Immediately wrong. Alara stood so fast the chair nearly tipped backward onto the floorboards. You nearly died protecting me. The orc stared toward the fire silently. People die protecting things. God above. The calmness inside his voice nearly shattered her completely. Like sacrifice felt ordinary now. Expected. The herbalist crossed the room before stopping directly beside the cot. No, her voice shook slightly. People protect things they care about. Reg finally looked up at her then, and the exhaustion inside his eyes hurt worse than the wound somehow. Interesting. Like he wanted believing her, but didn't know how. The cabin remained quiet except for crackling firewood and distant winter winds moving softly through the forest outside. Then finally the orc spoke. Very softly this time. I forgot what this felt like. Alara frowned slightly. What? Another long silence. Then, wanting to survive. God. The sentence hollowed her chest completely. Not dramatic sadness. Simple exhausted truth. Like before the cabin. Before her. Reg genuinely stopped caring whether he lived through another winter at all. The herbalist sat carefully beside him afterward while warm firelight flickered across old scars and fresh bandages both. Then quietly she asked, when did that happen? Reg stared toward the ceiling beams above them. After Dren died. Another pause. After the war. His jaw tightened slightly. After realizing I survived longer than better people did. Interesting thing about grief. People often mistook survival for theft. Alara carefully reached toward his rough, scarred hand resting beside the blankets. Reg tensed automatically beneath the touch. Still, then slowly relaxed. Progress. Beautiful, fragile progress. You're allowed living after terrible things happen, she whispered. Silence stretched. Heavy enough, feeling sacred somehow. Then unexpectedly, Reg's fingers tightened gently around hers. The smallest movement. Still enough, stealing her breath completely. The orc looked toward her carefully afterward, like speaking the next words terrified him more than battle ever could. You gave me something worth living for. God above. The confession shattered the quiet cabin completely. Not dramatic. Not polished. Honest. The kind of honesty dragged painfully from lonely, wounded people who rarely trusted anyone with their hearts anymore. Alara felt tears burning suddenly behind her eyes. because she understood exactly what he meant. The cabin, the warmth, the quiet mornings, the terrible tea. Her hope returned slowly to him here. And maybe, just maybe, it returned to her too. Outside, snow drifted softly through the northern forest while warm firelight wrapped around the little cabin where war, grief, and loneliness finally began loosening their grip on two broken people learning how surviving could become living again. And sitting beside the scarred orc hunter who once collapsed outside her door believing death would have been easier than being saved, Alara Vey realized one extraordinary truth completely. Love didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly beside a fireplace and simply gave someone a reason staying alive. The northern forest felt different by spring, quieter. For the first time in years, no soldiers marched through the mountain trails beyond Alara's cabin. No smoke darkened the distant valleys. No frightened refugees stumbled through the woods carrying stories about burned villages and endless war. The fighting finally ended before winter fully released its grip on the mountains. Interesting thing about wars. They always ended quietly compared to how loudly they destroyed everything first. Weeks passed peacefully afterward, then months. And somehow, Reg stayed. Not because injuries trapped him anymore, because leaving stopped making sense. The cabin slowly transformed around them as spring sunlight melted the last traces of snow from the forest floor outside. Alara planted herbs again near the riverbank, while Reg rebuilt the old porch stronger than before after the soldiers shattered half of it during the attack. Together. Always together now. Interesting thing about lonely people finding each other. Home stopped feeling like place and started feeling like person instead. One warm morning, Alara woke to the sound of chopping wood outside the cabin. Not alarming anymore. Comforting. The herbalist stepped onto the porch carrying teacups only to stop completely at the sight waiting below. Reg stood near the tree line laughing softly while helping village children aim hunting bows toward straw targets set beside the river. God above. Children. Warm spring wind drifted softly through the trees surrounding the cabin while sunlight shimmered across the river nearby. Peaceful. Finally peaceful. Reg leaned one shoulder against the porch railing quietly watching the children continue shooting terrible arrows across the clearing. Then softly he said, I used to think surviving was punishment. Alara looked toward him carefully. The orc stared out across the forest instead of meeting her eyes. After the war ended, after Dren died, another pause. I couldn't understand why I was still here when better people weren't. God above. The old guilt still lingered sometimes. Not as sharp now. Still there. Alara rested one hand gently against his arm. And now, silence stretched softly between them. Birdsong drifted through the trees. Children laughed near the river. Then finally Reg looked toward her, and the warmth inside his eyes nearly shattered her completely. Now I think maybe surviving gave me a chance earning peace instead. Interesting. Not redemption. Peace. The difference mattered. Alara smiled softly before leaning against him beneath the morning sunlight, while the northern forest breathed quietly around them. No soldiers. No war. No running. Home. The realization settled warmly through her chest. Months ago, a wounded orc hunter collapsed outside her cabin, believing his life ended already. Now he planted herbs badly, terrified fish from the river by standing too close to the water, and secretly carved wooden wolves for village children when he thought nobody noticed. God above. The world healed him slowly. But love healed him first. Later that evening, after the children returned safely home through the forest trails, Reg and Alara sat together beside the fireplace, while rain tapped softly against the cabin windows. The orc handed her something quietly. Another carving. This one better than the first. A wolf standing beside a small cabin beneath pine trees. Alara traced careful fingers across the wood before noticing words carved into the bottom edge. The place I stopped running. God. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Reg looked embarrassed immediately afterward. Interesting thing about tough warriors. Tenderness usually terrified them most. The herbalist laughed softly through tears before pulling him into a kiss tasting like cedar smoke, pine tea, and every quiet, hopeful thing surviving after grief finally loosened its grip on two lonely people. Outside, spring rain washed gently through the northern forest while warm firelight flickered across the cabin where war finally ended not through victory or violence, but through kindness stubborn enough, saving one wounded soul who believed he no longer deserved staying alive. And holding the scarred orc hunter who once collapsed dying in the snow outside her door, Elara Vey realized one extraordinary truth completely. Sometimes the greatest thing one person could give another wasn't rescue. It was a reason to stop running forever.